Thank you very much, James. I won't keep you any longer than is necessary. I'll ask you to give Jim a round of applause, please, and Jim's going to talk on our relationship with the European Union. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, and thank you very much, James, for inviting me along to speak tonight to Owen. And it's quite appropriate that we should finish speaking about that ever-present subject of local politics, that's dog mess, because, quite frankly, what we're seeing across the European Union with regards to foreign policy is, quite frankly, dog mess. And we are in a situation where only yesterday the European Union Committee at the House of Lords reported that, as far as they were concerned, with regards to the issue of Ukraine and the crisis that is developing now with Russia, we have, quite frankly, walked into it blindfolded and not be paying proper attention to it. And that, to me, sums up the frustration that I find as an MEP who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. And I'm going to be blunt with you, we are at a fateful crossroads in our history, because something has got to give. And I'm no fan of Mr. Putin, but Mr. Putin is the one who's going to come out better from this one. Because the trouble we have is we have 28 individual European Union member states who, quite frankly, have very different foreign policy interests. And it strikes me, from a British perspective, of once having control of the largest empire in the history of mankind, with areas right across the globe where we still have that influence. Our history is very different to the history of many of those other member states. In fact, many of those other member states weren't even in existence as long as Britain's been, actively re-engaging with the Commonwealth. And we have a situation where we have to look globally, because, to my point, the world is becoming a far smaller place. So I'm not being small-minded in my approach to saying I want Britain to leave the European Union, because I'm seeing a global future for our country. It's my contention, it's my opponents in the European Union, the very Euro-federalists, are the people who are being small-minded. Because all they're interested in is one thing, and that is the European Union. And that is all that is important to them. And they have this neo-imperialistic ambition, despite the agreement at the end of the Cold War, that Western countries had no international interest in the former Soviet areas. We are now seeing rapid expansion from the European Union into former Soviet countries. And so it didn't come as a surprise to me to see in the European Parliament we have various association agreements where these agreements are signed, trading and basic policy agreements with regards to a precursor for membership of the European Union. Now, these association agreements are being signed very frequently. We've just signed one with Moldova. But what struck me with regards to the issue with the association agreement signed with the Ukraine was how quickly it went through the Parliament. I'd only just become a member of the European Parliament. In fact, I think it was probably the first or second committee meeting I attended as an MEP. And the association agreement was rushed through so quickly. So much so that the International Trade Committee, which my colleague William Dartmouth, one of the MEPs in the South West, sits on, they weren't even given the option or the ability to discuss the negotiations with regards to the international trade elements of the association agreement. And it was all because, ladies and gentlemen, why I wanted this big showpiece vote in the European Parliament, because it was all set up where the big parties and the big blocs had agreed in principle that Ukraine should have an association agreement with the European Union, knowing full well the irresponsibility of those actions and what effects that would have on the Russian government. And yet they wanted to proceed. And so the quickest way to get this through, it was a matter of timing, was to just push it through without due diligence being given by the committees across the European Parliament. Now, I'm not there to make the European Parliament work, and I'm not there to defend the European Union. I'm there to represent the 428,000 UKIP voters in the West Midlands who put me there to fly the flag and say that Britain is better off out. So I'm not there to make the European Parliament work. But surely, irrespective of your politics, if you're pro or anti, you would agree that if this so-called sham of a parliament really is a parliament, they should at least have the ability to go to various committees within that parliament before agreeing the terms of an association agreement. But of course that went out the window, because it's all about showmanship in the European Union, because what we saw was the vote that took place in the European Parliament coincided with a satellite link to the Ukrainian Parliament. And there was a vote almost immediately, as there was a vote in the European Parliament, to sign the association agreement. And so it's all about showmanship and politics. But it's my contention, what I'm spending equally as much time on the Foreign Affairs Committee, is the greatest serious threat to civilization since the birth of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. Now, of course, is the rise of Islamic State. And there can be no doubt, and we see this not just from a British context, where we have a large number of British citizens have now gone to fight for the Islamic State in Syria, but we also see it with German citizens, with French citizens, and indeed with citizens from across the 28 member states. And it's my contention now that now IS have control of quite large cities in Libya. We have a situation where, aside of the fifth column that exists, as Nigel Farage so, I don't think it was controversial, you know, yeah, so eloquently put across that there are issues within this country, but as well as our own internal problems, which our own moderate Muslim communities are having difficulty containing, we have this issue now where Islamic State literally is on our doorstep. And of course, once anybody has access within the European Union, it's very easy to move around. So we have a situation where we have to face up to this real threat, where we saw what happened to the dozen or so Coptic Christians in the Egyptians. Was it 20? Was it working over the working over the border? We saw what happened to them. We see regularly what happens. We saw what happened to the brave Jordanian pilots. And this, we have to challenge this mindset. And whether we like Mr. Putin or not, and I really, honestly, am no fan of President Putin, but we have to appreciate there's one word that speaks out with regards to this wider context of this battle, and that word is diplomacy. And whether we like it or not, we have to accept that Russian foreign policy interests are markedly different to British and indeed European Union foreign policy interests. And we find ourselves in a situation where we have this tragedy in Syria, and yet Mr. Putin has far better diplomatic relations with the Assad regime and with the Iranian regime than we can ever hope for. And surely we should be reaching out, whether we like it or not, to the Iranians, to the Syrians, who can help us in this battle against Islamic State. Now, this is the seriousness of the situation. But of course, what the Russians are now doing, they've got the diplomatic chessboard out. And they're making different moves. We saw only yesterday 2 Russian bombers off the Cornish coast who, you know, were just outside British sovereign airspace. And what the Russians are doing, they're not being aggressive, they're not declaring acts of war, but what they're doing, they're telling the British government that, you know, you need to be aware of our military capabilities. But of course, there's one area which may have been overlooked by some of you, and that is the fact that last month Argentina completed a trade deal with Russia. And it was a wheat for bombers deal, and now Argentina has long-range bombers on loan from the Russian government, surplus to Russian requirements. So that has been caused by the push on Eastern Europe, this neo-imperialism I spoke about. So now the British government has to go away and spend a couple of £100 million reassessing our strategy in the South Atlantic territories. All because our foreign policy interests are completely different to the majority of the 28 member states of the European Union. And there is, of course, this call for commonality, and that is a word I often hear when I'm in Strasbourg and Brussels, commonality, because the federalists, the fanatics, like to think we're all the same. You know, what is Europe? To my mind, the beauty of Europe is its diversity. The fact that, you know, we all have our different business practices, our own cultures. That's, to me, what makes Europe special. But trying to homogenise us, pasteurise us, and make us all the same can only lead, quite frankly, in my opinion, to tragedy. If we look at history, we see what's happened before when Napoleon and Hitler tried to do the same. So we have to be looking globally, and we have to take a different approach. And it's my contention that the European Union call, would you believe, for a common foreign and security policy and a common foreign and defence policy, which you, ladies and gentlemen, will no doubt never have heard of. Go home and look it up. This is what the call is now. They want a common policy with regards to, you know, our foreign policy and our defence policy. But that's ridiculous because, as I've said, Britain has different international requirements, as indeed does France. You know, France has her colonies. Look at the issue of, look, how can we have a common foreign policy just on the issue of Gibraltar, when the Spanish keep, you know, infringing British sovereign waters and airspace, blitzing passenger jets, trying to start a civilian passenger plane. How can we have a common foreign policy? And in the same respect, taking Britain out of it, how can we have a common foreign policy and defence policy when you have countries such as the Republic of Ireland and Austria who have been neutral? They are traditionally neutral countries. So that brings in, if you look at it from another international context, that brings in to question the neutrality of those traditionally neutral countries. And this, to my mind, is why the European Union cannot work. Because we've seen what's happened in Greece, we've seen about the economic follies there, we've seen about this stalemate that's going forwards. At the end of the day, the European Union cannot allow Greece to leave the Eurozone. And in my contention, there's only one reason why that is, and that is because if Greece leaves the Eurozone, they will have a situation after a couple of years of pain where she gets back on her feet and people start investing in the country, exactly as happened in Iceland after the banking crisis in Iceland. Iceland was left to sort out its own mess. It wasn't propped up. The banks failed. And look at Iceland now. Iceland is on the recovery. But of course, this is all about politics, because it doesn't just affect Greece. France has its problems. But more importantly, there are larger problems facing the economies of Portugal, Italy and Spain. So if Greece is allowed to leave the Eurozone, you will have a situation in a couple of years' time where the Portuguese, the Italians and the Greeks will look at it, and the Spanish will look at the situation. So, well, actually, they're not doing so bad. But if we hear what President Juncker, the President of the European Commission, has said, and if we hear what Herr Schauble, the German Foreign Minister, has said, politics doesn't matter. You know, the European Eurozone is a project that will continue. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why it is so important, not just in the United Kingdom, but across the 28 member states. We have this growing bandwagon, this flowing boulder, which is gradually gathering momentum, of people, moderate people, saying there is actually a better alternative to this. And that is what UKIP stands for. Because we've been a member of this club for 42 years now. We joined when I was 3 years old. I know I look a lot older. We joined when I was 3 years old. Of course, my mum, she voted for a common market because she was sold the line. It was all about cheap wine. It was all about free trade. But from the word go, our politicians lied to us. And ladies and gentlemen, they have been hiding the truth from us ever since. No, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist, just look at the names of the treaties we've signed. The Single European Act, well, that speaks for itself. Maastricht, the Treaty on European Union. You know, it speaks for itself. But after 42 years, I believe, and my party believes, that there is a better option. And as Nigel said so eloquently last week, we believe in Britain. And you're going to hear those words a lot. Believe in Britain. Because that is going to be the concept of our coming general election campaign. Because we believe in our country. We have the confidence that the failed parties, the Lib Lab Con, don't have. We believe that there is a better future for Britain. And that is outside the European Union, not just re-engaging with the Commonwealth, but building better links with the emerging markets, regaining our own place on the World Trade Organisation, which at the moment, of course, is occupied by the European Union. So we've been in a position where we'll be able to negotiate our own trade agreements to the best interests of the United Kingdom. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just one concept of how we won't be marginalised when we leave the European Union. And I really do believe that we stand at the most interesting time in British politics. Never in the history of, well, recent history, have we had a situation, almost went into a Churchill quote, didn't I? Never have we had a situation where the respected political pundits won't stake their reputations on the outcome of the general election. You know, the Nick Robinsons, the John Pinars, the respected, the John Humphreys, the respected politicians from across the media, because they can't call it. And the reason they can't call it, ladies and gentlemen, is because, as Nigel so often says, with regards to the other three parties, you can't put a fag paper between the three of them. But UKIP stands ready because for the first time since 1908, at last year's European elections, a political party outside the top two won a national election when we got 4.2 million votes in those European elections. And that tells me that people are ready for change. And that was underlined, you may recall, when Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless defected from the Conservative Party. And they did the honourable thing. They didn't just walk across the floor, as so many who have changed sides before have done. They said, no, I'm elected by the good people of Rochester and Struth and Clacton, so it's up to them. So not only did they change parties, but they resigned their seats, forcing a by-election. And we remember what they were all saying, oh, you know, we're gonna go at it hammer and tongs. Carswell won't hold Clacton. Well, look what happened. Over 60% of the votes, he got in Clacton. And as for Rochester and Struth, the Conservative Party were going to throw the kitchen sink. That was the Prime Minister's very words. We're going to throw the kitchen sink at Rochester and Struth to stop UKIP. Well, with respect, I don't even think he put the plug in, because the votes didn't just come from the Conservatives, the votes came from the Labour Party, and more interestingly is that we are taking votes, 20% now of the people who support UKIP haven't voted in the two previous general elections. And that tells me that because of UKIP, voter turnout is actually higher than it would be if we just relied on a dismal three other parties. So we have an opportunity to move forward now. And if you're not a member, I'd urge you to come on board, support us, join us, leaflet for us. If you can't do that, perhaps you put a poster up in your garden, vote for us. Go out and tell your friends if you like what we've said tonight. Don't tell them if you don't like what we said, but go out and tell them, because what we're doing, we're engaging with the public. You won't find any of the other major parties holding public meetings on a Friday evening. You know, we want to get out, we want to be heard. And I really do believe we have the chance to get our country back and change our country for the better. But there is only one way this can be done. And that is not just voting for the local council candidates for UKIP across the borough on May the 7th, but also on May the 7th, using that other votes. And on May the 7th, I say to you, if you really want to take that first step to get your country back, then I ask you to return James Goad as your Member of Parliament. Thank you.